Hello, hello. Welcome to the Henry George program. I'm Mark Molyneux, and I'm joined by co-host Jacob Schwartz-Lucas, representing EarthSharing.org and the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. This program dedicated to finding practical answers to the housing crisis, economic volatility, inequality, and environmental degradation here in the Bay Area and beyond. We compare and contrast the ideas of the 19th century economist Henry George with that of both historical and contemporary thinkers. Also addressed our issues ranging from artificial intelligence, automation, and universal basic income to city planning and the land value tax, a concept popularized by George.
This week, we're joined by James Howard Kunstler. According to TED.com, Kunstler is the world's most outspoken critic of suburban sprawl. He believes the end of the fossil fuels era will soon force a return to smaller-scale agrarian communities and an overhaul of the most destructive features of post-World War II society. He is perhaps best known for his nonfiction books, The Geography of Nowhere, The Long Emergency, and Too Much Magic. James has also written The City in Mind, Notes on the Urban Condition, World Made by Hand, a fictional depiction of, quote, the post-oil American future, which became a four-part series with the subsequent publication of The Witch of Hebron, if I'm pronouncing that right, A History of the Future, and The Harrows of Spring. James Howard Kunstler is the author of 8 other novels, including The Halloween Ball and An Embarrassment of Riches. He is a contributor to the New York Times Sunday Magazine and op-ed page, where he has written on environmental and economic issues. Mr. Kunstler was born in New York City. He worked as a reporter and feature writer for a number of newspapers, and finally as a staff writer for Rolling Stone magazine. He has lectured at colleges across America and performed one of the most watched TED Talks. Welcome to the Henry George program, Jim.
Hi, Jacob. Nice to talk to you. And by the way, I actually have a new book out. Came out about a week and a half ago. It's called A Safe and Happy Place, and it's about a hippie commune in Vermont in 1968, and it's narrated by its 19-year-old female main character. So you can get it at Amazon and check it out.
Interesting, yeah. So I wanted to ask you, you're a big fan of better urban planning to reduce sprawl and the accompanying resource destruction. You've written that, quote, it is too early to say that land value taxation has proven unequivocally to be a superior system of taxation, but the evidence points in that direction. I'm paraphrasing, but that's almost the exact same quote, indicating that you also think it's possible for a kind of spontaneous as opposed to planned way to solve the problem of urban sprawl. Do you think that's accurate? Could you please elaborate?
Well, I'm not the world's greatest expert on Georgist economics and taxation, but I did write about it for my book, Home from Nowhere, which was a sequel to The Geography of Nowhere. And it came about largely because in my reportage for The Geography of Nowhere, I began to get in touch with people who were forming the new urbanist movement, which was a reform movement among architects and developers and urban planners and public officials to do something about what has become a kind of mandated suburban sprawl. And when I say mandated, I mean we have been literally compelled to build all of our stuff that way because of the embedded codes and the tax laws in our system. And one of the Georgist land taxing system came to my attention really after The Geography of Nowhere came out. And it seems to me that it just is a more sensible way to attach value to land. And I suppose your listeners understand the basic principle of it, which is that you tax the value of the location of the land, the locational value of the land, rather than merely taxing the things that you put on it. Because when you tax the buildings rather than the locational value of the land, you end up essentially punishing people for putting up good buildings. Because the bigger they are, or the more activity that they have in them, or the more rents they generate, the higher the taxes are going to be. And The Henry George version of locational taxing does not do that. It taxes the land on the value of it in relation to its centrality to the city center, and so in the long run, it would tend to promote the more compact development of city centers and to maintain the value of the city centers, even in spite of all of the other forces that promote suburban sprawl. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Oh, not at all. I suppose one way to look at it is to say that, why would anyone ever choose to go out to the suburbs to build there? The cities where the action is, but it's very expensive.
Well, there is an answer to that. There's a pretty simple answer, and it's actually my new theory of history, which is that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. And it's not that hard to understand why America took up the suburban project. First of all, American cities grew up and expanded in tandem with the industrial adventure. So that the industrial era kind of comes on really strong in the early 1800s. At the same time, just after America has really formally become a nation, at the same time that our cities are forming. And, the further west you go, on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, the less older pre-1800 urban fabric there is. And so we developed these industrial cities, and by the mid to late 1800s, people are beginning to notice they're not very nice places to live. Because of the factories and the smoke and the noise and increasingly large neighborhoods of gibbering foreigners who are coming over here to work in the factories and a lot of forces are kind of gathering to prompt people to want to leave the suburbs. And at the same time, we have this mythology about, life on the frontier and the frontier homestead and the little cabin in the woods and, all of these kind of basically psychological fantasies that are embedded in American culture about being out there in the countryside on your own. And that kind of, evolves into the template for suburbia. And it begins with the railroad suburbs in the late 1800s, and then you get the trolley car suburbs from about 1890 to about 1920. And after that, it's all about the car and, the liberation of people from the constraints of the city. And we also had a very large continental-sized nation with quite a bit of empty land out there in the countryside, outside the cities. And so, you get tremendous opportunities for real estate fortunes. These are conditions that didn't quite exist in the same way outside of European cities. And European nations had different sorts of land tenancy laws, that is to say ownership laws. In Great Britain, for example, the system of the 99-year lease on property is much more common than in the United States, where it's almost unknown. And a lot of London was developed, as a matter of fact, on 99-year property leases, so that you never really owned the property. You just put a building on there with some expectation that it would still be okay. 99 years later, your great grandchildren could renegotiate the lease. So. I've also gone on too long about that, but there are reasons that suburbia happened, and it seemed like a good idea at the time.
What would you say about people who would make the comment, if you have to pay a tax on the land or if you only get a 99-year lease, then it's as though you don't really own the land. And this is very offensive to many Americans if you bring this idea up. Well, you didn't create the land. It just existed, so why should you have an undying right to own it without any kind of duty to anybody else? How would you respond to that kind of?
Well,
sentiment?
first of all, the idea that people that citizens do not have duties, responsibilities, and obligations to the common good is a false idea. And that's never been true in America. So, the people who say, don't tell me what to do with my land, they're simply misstating a historical circumstance. America has been a fairly liberty-based culture, but it's never been altogether, your rights have never been altogether completely devoid of duties and responsibilities to the public interest. Even in colonial societies like Williamsburg, Virginia, the authorities were telling people how to orient their houses towards the street and other issues of how they use their property. But even today, most people must realize that to some extent or another, that, if they're paying any property taxes at all, and just to, everybody who owns property is paying some kind of property tax, that you're essentially in some kind of a rental situation with the government. So, I don't think that comes as news to anybody. So the idea that people out there own their property free and clear is kind of a universal illusion.
Well, as far as, sharing the wealth of a city, you can look at the idea of suburbs as being kind of the crappier way to do wealth sharing. Instead of sharing in the productive city, you should say, well, you can't, have this land, but there's plenty of land in the suburbs. You go out there and you can become, you can have your own land, do your own thing. But I guess now we're starting to see a lot of these suburbs run out, at least around here in the Bay Area. There's no more suburbs to be had. And I just wonder.
Sure. Well, it had a kind of a characteristic of a Ponzi scheme, too, that especially in terms of paying for municipal services, that, you're just forever, borrowing from the future to pay for the stuff that you're doing today. And that has actually been the pattern in general for the U.S. economy for about 30 or 40 years. And the chickens are coming home to roost on that one.
I guess if you're being optimistic, you say, okay, we realize this doesn't work. You can't finance the suburbs out of the initial sprawl forever. It will run out. The finances don't work out. But is that too optimistic? Are we going to, be goldfish and just do the same thing again? I don't know if I should be optimistic.
Well, that's not the only basis for the failure of suburbia. Suburbia is essentially a living arrangement with no future and has been for quite a while. As I said, it happened because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and it had a lot to do with the historic circumstances that we were in. We had at the time when we embarked on the suburban project, when we embarked on the suburban project in the 1920s. There was very little thought that we would ever have a problem with our oil supply. We thought that it would not only be there perpetually, but that it would be, incredibly cheap forever. And we never thought we would run out of cheap, exploitable real estate on the fringe of the city. It just seemed impossible. But, now in a place like the Bay Area, you're there. So, what seemed like a good idea at the time is not a good idea anymore. And not only that, the terms of the quality of suburban living have gone through a significant change. It started out as the idea of country living for everybody. That was the idea. The democratic spread of country living for all people, so everybody could share in that psychological fantasy about living on the frontier. But it very quickly mutated into a cartoon of a country house and a cartoon of a country landscape. So that when you move to the suburbs these days, there's very little illusion that you're moving to the country or that you're living a country life or a rural life. And I think just about everybody, especially in California, understands the drawbacks and disadvantages and deformities of suburban living now after all of our experience with it. But all of that is neither here or there because I think the truth is we're simply not going to be economically able to carry on with it. There are too many things militating in the background that are going to prevent us from living that way. And we have to return to probably traditional dispositions of inhabiting the landscape, namely real towns, real villages, real cities, which, by the way, are all just iterations of the same basic template. One neighborhood is a village, and several neighborhoods and a main street is a town, and many neighborhoods and a few business districts comprises a city. So, that whole traditional mode of inhabiting the landscape works at different scales, but it remains to be seen, how large our cities actually can be, and there's more to say about that, and exactly how we're going to be able to redevelop into some kind of a traditional relationship with the landscape.
And, well, in terms of oil use, what do you think is the optimal situation? When I think about it, people, when they're imagining an environmentalist lifestyle, they think of a cabin in the woods, right? But in reality, what's environmentally probably the most sustainable is living in quite a tall building where all of the heat and the cooling is being reused, and people don't need to get in their cars to go to the grocery store. So what would you think would be ideal?
Well, that's partially a fallacy too, actually, and it was
Is it? Okay.
it was actually generated by a New Yorker magazine writer named David Owen, who published a piece about 10 years ago that said that Manhattan was the greenest place to live in America because you could stack so many people up in a skyscraper, and the footprint of a large population would be smaller. But that's not true either. There's really something there's a happy medium there, and I think in the future we're probably going to discover that the skyscraper, including the residential tower, the residential tall building, that these things are going to be obsolete building forms too, and that we'll discover that there's a kind of an optimum size for an urban footprint, which probably, in my guess, is that it's probably not much more than 5, 6, 7 stories. And it may amount to, as simple a proposition as the number of stories that you can ask people to walk up comfortably. But it's simply not true that, if you can just stack so many people in an urban spot, that's the greatest solution. And in fact, it won't be. We're not going to be able to do that. We're not. We're going to discover that our megastructures have only one generation of life, and for two reasons. First of all, we're moving into a capital scarce period of history where we just don't have as much money as we thought we did and as we used to. And we're going to have trouble with fabricated modular building materials of the type that you need to keep these buildings going, even things as humble as sheetrock, which require long manufacturing and mining chains, and these materials may not be there for us. So, if you ask the architects and the developers about the skyscraper, they will never come around to that idea because for them, the prime mission is to maximize the floor to area ratio of any given building lot. And so the whole question of what the city ends up being in scale is a major we're ready for a major debate on that, and we're not prepared to have it because very few people have their heads screwed on about this.
Well, I think if you look around now, it seems that is there demand to live in the big cities we have? There's a ton of demand. I think you could say there should be demand for a city like San Francisco to grow into the next Hong Kong or something. And if you say, why aren't there skyscrapers here? It's not the capital that's lacking. It's the will to let it grow.
No, you're quite wrong about that, and I'll tell you why. Because the places where there has been enormous demand for urban living and urban real estate are places that have gotten to where they are almost completely due to the financialization of the economy in the last 50 years, and especially in the last 20, 30 years, last 2-3 decades. And we're coming to the end of the era of the financialization of the economy. And we're going to discover that a lot of that financialization was based on putative wealth that is really not there. that was in one way or another sort of based on fraud or is sort of hallucinated wealth. And as that vanishes, we're going to be confronting a whole new situation.
So for a young person who doesn't really, I guess, if they say financialization, I don't know what you're talking about. I just want to live in San Francisco, but I can't afford it. What do you tell them? Why is this something that is kind of a passing fallacy?
Well, I've said the same thing to people who want to move to Brooklyn on the East Coast, and because the financialization of the economy was based on a trade in securities which don't really represent what they pretend to represent. Whether they're stocks or bonds or derivatives of one sort or another, and we're going to come to a reckoning with that, and it's going to change the terms of how we do business in America. Business in America is not going to be just based on the digital trading of stocks and things. We're going to have to go back to the reality of life. For example, feeding the population. Because as this is occurring, we're also, it's also combining with what will be a resource problem, especially an energy resource problem, which is already upon us. And most Americans don't understand it. There's been an enormous propaganda campaign by the oil industry and their friends to kind of flim-flam the American public into thinking that we don't have a problem with oil, but we do have a problem with oil. It's a very big problem, and it's directly related to our ability to generate credit and debt, which are more or less the same thing, and all of the financial instruments that are based on them. And as these two problems combine, we're going to see a lot of disorder in the financial system, as well as the practicalities of daily living and the development of property.
So one other argument people can make for saying why people tend to get in the same place is the network effects of the economy. People all want to be in San Francisco because that's where the jobs in software are. Do you think that would change in the future, where people don't need to be in the same place, or do you think that network effects will persist?
Well, I think, I do think that network effects will persist, but they will persist into an economy that will go through some probably pretty drastic and disorienting changes. And I can't say that much. I can't speak that much for the software industry, the computer industry, except to say I have a feeling that most of the important developments in that are behind us, and that a lot of the things that we're anticipating are probably not going to come about in the ways that we imagine. And there are all kinds of diminishing returns and blowback that we have embedded in our economic life in America. Let me give you a funny example from the other day. I had I had an email from a guy who told me with a sort of a sense of triumph that it was a great thing that the electric car was coming along because it would put the oil industry out of business, and then we wouldn't have to bother with fossil fuels anymore or burning fossil fuels, and then we'd all be good with electric cars. It didn't seem to occur to this guy that if you kill the oil industry, you won't have any asphalt for repairing the roads that the electric cars are supposed to run on. So, I think the kind of thinking that we're seeing out there is very short-sighted, and people aren't really connecting the dots.
Actually, just on that idea about asphalt, there was an interesting article in the New Yorker this week about the scarcity of sand in making asphalt. And you realize that scarcity can pop up just about anywhere. People don't realize that resources run out just when you least expect it.
And there's another thing connected with that, which is known as Liebig's law of the minimum, which is that you got a bunch of resources or a bunch of things that you need to produce a certain kind of a product, like a car. And if you run out of one, you can't, it doesn't matter how much of the other stuff you have, you can't make the car. If you run out of copper, if you run out of lithium for a battery, if you if you run out of one thing or another, you're not that will make it not work. And that's exactly what you see with this idea that we're going to be able to have electric cars without asphalt. You know, if you don't have the pavements, you're not going to be able to run the cars. And the only other way to make pavement that we know about so far is concrete. And concrete requires enormous amounts of heat to manufacture. So, that generally has come from fossil fuels. Now you could say, oh, well, we can make it out of nuclear energy. Well, yeah, except that we're reaching the end of the life of many of the nuclear power generation plants out there, and we're not seeing any intention of replacing them, any serious intention. There's a lot of blowback in there, and there are a lot of unforeseen problems in there that we're not taking into account.
For many people, their opposition to car culture and sprawl, really stems from an opposition to technological advancement, or at least a more of a pessimism or a lack of techno-utopianism. And, it seems that your approach is merely that technology should conform to standards of livability and sustainability. Do you think it's possible to respect these values even with, thousands of years from now, futuristic technological advancement? When we have things like nanotechnology, mega-scale engineering in outer space, some far-flung type stuff. Do you see a way to synthesize these two values?
Well, my position these days, having written a book called Too Much Magic, and the subtitle of that was Wishful Thinking, Technology, and the Fate of the Nation. My position is that a great deal of what you're describing goes into my folder that is labeled techno-narcissism or techno-grandiosity. I think we have way overblown notions about what we're really able to do or what these things will do for us. So I don't take a lot of that stuff really seriously. In fact, I go so far to say that we would benefit much more from a timeout from technological so-called progress than from continuing on the same track we're on at the moment. And in any case, I think we're going to get it whether we want it or not. I think we're going to have a timeout from what we regard as technological progress, whether we like it or not. Now, to answer the first part of your question, which is sort of about the quality of the environments that we produce using technologies such as the automobile, I think what we've learned, what we've demonstrated over the last 100 years, is that we've created an everyday environment that is extremely punishing to the human spirit, to the human neurology, to human psychology. That we've created everyday environments that people really hate, that make them feel bad. And I think you can describe this pretty simply, that the immersive ugliness of the American landscape as we know it today is entropy made visible. It's as simple as that. And entropy, of course, is that force in physics and in nature that drives things towards stasis and death and, darkness and cold. And I think people perceive that in the horror of the American suburban landscape, with all of its ghastly furnishings and accessories, the muffler shops and the highway strips and the 9-lane highways and the on-ramps and the off-ramps and the traffic and the one-story horrible tilt-up buildings and the clownish fast food buildings and, all of that crapola. Just people probably, as an empirical matter, I think they find it tremendously neurologically disturbing. But we're immersed in it, and I suppose that most people kind of feel they're stuck with it, and I think we kind of are.
Well, but surely, things like the polio vaccine, the fact that we now have anesthesia, so people don't have to go under surgery and feel enormous pain. These are not the type of technological advancements you'd like to be put on pause. Sure, we have, negative things like the way car culture has distorted.
Yeah, I'm not a Luddite, but I do think that we have to view the last 200 years of industrial and technological civilization as being something of an anomaly in human history, and not necessarily a permanent condition that continues to just arc upward forever. I think that we're living in a universe of sine, cosine waves in which things go up and things go down and things go up and things go down. And I think that we're heading for a less progressive and less innovative period of history. And a lot of the fantasies that we have are simply not going to come true. I find that, for example, Elon Musk's fantasy about traveling to Mars and establishing colonies on Mars to be absolutely idiotic. We haven't even demonstrated that we're capable of living on this planet successfully, and it's set up perfectly for human beings. So, we want to go to a planet that's millions of miles away, that is completely inhospitable to life as we know it, and we think we're going to succeed in colonizing it. He's out of his mind. And the fact that, people unquestionably accept his fantasy, I think, is a kind of lunacy. And we can't afford to be that crazy anymore. There are too many things going on with us that are going to be enormous problems. And, we don't have time for that nonsense.
So as far as like the suburbs and just kind of the overall, mental psychic effect it has, definitely the suburbs today are uglier than the suburbs of the 1920s or 1950s. There's a downward trend. Do you think it's plunging further and further down?
Well, yeah, I think the quality, when suburban life was first established, we had carried over a lot of habits and customs and practices from an earlier period that still allowed us to build things that were fairly satisfying. And for example, the sheer carpentry in houses in the turn of the 20th century. These are some of the most beautiful houses that America ever produced, but it had a lot to do with the fact that we had a lot of very skilled and fairly cheap labor. We had stone cutters, we had really excellent carpenters who, there's an interesting phenomenon that I've noticed, that as the tools have gotten better for building stuff, especially in the last couple of decades, with the laser-guided measuring devices and the compound miter saws and, all these great new tools, the work is actually getting worse. So that you go to the average new suburban McMansion, the carpenters are so unskilled that even with all these great tools, they can't make a 45-degree miter on a door surround meet without a quarter-inch gap, between the two miters. So... I think that there were periods in American development, land development, and building that were better than others, and we're just in a kind of unfortunate, sad period. But a lot of it also had to do with the amount of money and a lot of the credit that has been available for people to borrow from the future to have the stuff and build the stuff that they do today.
Well, a Henry George type argument you can make is that when the land was cheap but the houses were nice, you're paying for the house. You want the house to be nice, but now when people are getting their big mortgage for 30 years, they're largely paying for the land. And the house, it's just basically the bare minimum that'll get you to agree to that location.
They're actually largely paying for the loan.
Yeah, and then the interest on it on top of it.
They're going to rack up in the course of their servicing their mortgage is going to be probably more than the cost of the house nominally.
Yeah, you start paying for the actual house and land many years into it after you just pay off the interest on it. But yeah, I mean, it's if you're just building the house yourself, it wouldn't be 30 years of labor even for a really nice house.
Yeah, of course not. And also remember, what we take to be the normal mortgage of our time was really an innovation that really didn't happen until about the 1930s. The standard for a while in America, when mortgages first came out, was you put 25% down on the cost of the house, and today people they put 10% or less down, and they have very little principle involved in the whole thing, and it ends up being just a kind of elaborate rental agreement between you and the mortgage holder.
I mean, it's not really that much different than the classic feudalist idea of you're mostly just, paying off just for the ability to live on the land. It's look at the poltroons of New York hundreds of years ago. It's the same.
Patroons.
Oh, excuse me.
Poltroon is a knavish person.
Yeah, so sorry about that. The patroons of New York 100 years ago. I mean, the patrons of this day are the mortgages you need for the bank to live on the land in your own town.
Sure.
Yeah.
But that's just another way of saying that we find any way possible to borrow from the future to pay for what we got today. The trouble is that the future is not going to be as generous as we thought it was. We're going to have problems with the resources in the future, especially the capital resources.
Yeah, I guess, but people, have a tendency to speculate. You hope that, okay, I'll borrow for the future, but it will work out for me. And for a while it did. And their optimism did work out. And, is it in our human nature to just make dumb bets like this over and over again?
Well, I think it's probably demonstrably in our human nature to think that whatever's going on now will continue forever. And that's just obviously not the case. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to everything. Including many of our social and economic arrangements. And, I'm constantly impressed by the assumptions that people make about how stuff is going to continue into the future, especially economic matters. So we need to wrap our heads around the idea that things can change pretty drastically and they can do it pretty quickly. And it is especially in the nature of complex systems of the sort that we are deeply embedded in, that we have embedded ourselves in, that complex systems have a tendency to sharp and fairly catastrophic failure when they do fail. Let me give you another financial example. The condominium system for financing property development has been a fairly new idea. It really didn't come on big time until the 1970s in the USA. And the condominium idea is this. You take a big structure like an apartment building with 100 apartments in it, and you break it up into 100 separate ownerships legally, and then they all pay into a property owners association on top of their mortgages. And the property association theoretically takes care of the building. And what you're going to see, I believe, is that this financing experiment is going to fail. And it's going to fail because if you get into a situation where even a small percentage of the members of the property association or the homeowners association get into trouble and can't pay their mortgages and can't pay their management fees, that property association is not going to be able to take care of the building, is not going to be able to pay the taxes. So these property associations are going to fail when, just a few people in the unit, in the building are unable to pay their property association fees or their mortgages. And it takes very few of them to screw up that system. And so, what seemed like a good idea at the time to condominiumize every building in America is going to turn out to be a tragic kind of blunder. But, as I said, it seemed like a good idea at the time, and then things change, and it's not anymore.
We saw that with exurban malls, and now the dead malls are littering every city of the country. It seemed like a great idea. They go on, but as soon as they start to fail, there is a domino effect, certainly.
Right. It's a similar thing, although, obviously, the individual store owners in a mall don't own the property. I mean, but the way it's similar is that it doesn't take that many vacancies for a shopping mall to stop being a profitable proposition. So, you get a mall that is starting to lose tenants, and then very swiftly the whole thing goes down, And one of the first signs of failure is when the wig shops start moving in and the marginal businesses, replace the chain stores and the Eagle Outfitters and the Gap goes away, and you get somebody selling secondhand model railroading stuff, and that's the end. So yeah, there are a lot of financial arrangements that we're now stuck with that are probably going to cause a good deal of harm to our culture, and fairly soon, because we are on the verge of going through a financial workout that is going to reestablish. We're going to see a general revaluing of all kinds of things, including the price of money as is expressed in interest rates, and the value of currencies, and the value of securities that are based on those currencies, and based on the real activity that's going on behind the securities, not just companies buying back their own stocks. And, there's going to be a big recognition that a lot of the wealth that we thought was there is actually not there.
So when we said wig shop a moment ago, I'm reminded I just visited my grandma in Elyria, Ohio, a small town outside of Cleveland that's getting smaller, and a wig store is the only thing downtown that is not going out of business. And I guess, where do you think a small city like that really has in this vision of the future? A city that used to be bigger, but now people are leaving for Cleveland, leaving for Chicago, leaving for all the bigger cities.
I think we're going to be really surprised at how the trends change. Whatever the trends are now, once again, do not assume that they are permanent conditions of the human project. In fact, what I think will happen is, because our cities are currently overscaled, they have attained a scale of operation that is simply unsupportable, unsustainable, and can't go on. And I think this will be recognized when the economy becomes definancialized. I think we will see a movement that will surprise a lot of people, and that is a movement back to smaller towns, a movement back to smaller cities that are scaled to the economic and resource realities of the future, which are going to be more austere than the conditions that we think we're in today. And we're also going to see a phenomenon where, because of some of the things I've touched on already, we're going to see a lot of trouble with agriculture the way we do it now, which is to say industrial agriculture, where you're basically growing all the food for America based on oil and natural gas-based products that you put on a sterile soil medium to grow the corn. And it's also heavily based on debt and financing and credit. And as that becomes a problem, I think you will see the places that are successful will be the places that have some meaningful relationship with agriculture and food production that is done differently. I think our farms are going to have to become smaller and probably will require more human attention to make them work. And the places that are not able to sustain agriculture near them are going to be places that get into trouble. I think places like Phoenix and Los Angeles and, basically most of the
places people shouldn't live.
Well, I think basically most of the American Southwest and the Rocky Mountains are going to be troubled places for that reason. And we're making a lot of assumptions about things continuing that are going to prove to be not true. So especially the giant metroplex cities, as they're called, I think are going to they're going to come under a lot of pressure. And I think we will discover that we just don't have the mojo to take care of them, to fix them, to raise the taxes necessary to keep them running. Every place from Houston to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Phoenix, Atlanta, etc.
I wanted to ask you more about farms. You said that they need more human attention, and one of the things that greatly attracted me to land value tax was the idea that, hey, if we move taxes off of people for working and exchanging and instead put the taxes on the land, then all of these huge monoculture farms that are bad for the environment and are heavily subsidized. Basically, it would encourage more laborers on the farms, and they'd get paid better because there'd just be a greater demand for people if you want to economize on land and not on people. And I'm wondering, to what degree do you think that the farms could move closer to the cities, and that might be a good thing. There's also demographic shift where people kind of move into cities and have less children. Do you think land value tax playing a role in this future could possibly avert some of the horrible prognostication, not in terms of the quality of the prognostication, but the outcome that you've mentioned?
Well, I think there are many forces that are now in motion that are going to compel us to live differently and grow our food differently. And it's, you have described certain forces that are currently with us that may not be with us in the future. But there are many other forces, some of which I've described, that I think will basically compel us to make farms smaller, it will require more people to work on them as we have fewer gasoline, fossil fuel, diesel-powered machines. And, let's face it, we also have a very large population of people who are doing nothing right now. And nobody seems to know what will happen to them. And I think what you'll see is that a lot of them will be moving back into agriculture. Now, this is a notion that a lot of people may find abhorrent because it has overtones of feudalism or sharecropping or all kinds of historic circumstances that people find very unappetizing. But nevertheless, I think that circumstances are going to compel us to do it. One of the problems we have in America is that we are very confused. We really don't have any boundary between our wishes and what we're really able to do. It's very fuzzy. And I think what we're going to discover the hard way is that reality has mandates of its own. And reality will compel us to do things, whether we wish these things to happen or not. And one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to have to probably devote more of our labor and more of our time and attention to food production, because the idea that you can produce cheese doodles for everybody in America, using only 3 farmers to do it all, that idea is going to go away, and we're not going to replace them with robots. We're probably going to have to just do farming a lot more carefully. And the places where you can still do that are going to have high value. For example, a lot of the region around the Great Lakes is, in my opinion, deeply undervalued today. This is a place, first of all, the Great Lakes are kind of like the freshwater Mediterranean Sea of America. It's a massive opportunity for transportation to get things from point A to point B that we hardly use anymore. The other thing about the Great Lakes is that, it's marvelous farmland all around the Great Lakes. Michigan, which is surrounded by water, is one of the great farming areas of the United States. And, you can grow anything there. You can grow grain, you can grow fruit, you can grow timber. I think we're going to discover that these places have tremendous value, and a lot of the towns in these places that are currently way undervalued and maybe even, still losing population, they're going to become important places again. I do, on the whole, think that the population is not going to continue growing the way it has, for one reason or another. And I think we should be prepared probably for that eventuality too.
So as far as change, as far as cities changing, and the boom and bust cycle of cities can be really painful. The boom tends to have a certain amount of psychic pain as far as sprawl and overpopulation and capacity goes. And the bust cycles are bad too, because after a sprawl, you tend to see a lot of vacancies and you tend to see a lot of things go into blight. I guess if a person bullish on a land tax would say cities could have a more sane boom and bust cycle around a core instead of this sprawl. And I guess the idea is, do you see this bust cycle, especially in sprawl, as being unnecessary? Do you think there's any reason we should have abandoned houses outside Detroit, for instance?
Well, a lot of what you're describing is a result of the tremendous deformations and dislocations of the industrial era. And we've had 200 years of that, and we think that the cycles associated with that are normal. But they may not be historically. The historic cycles might be larger and longer. For example, the Roman Empire and the city of Rome. Rome went from a city of over 1 million people at its height, probably around, 200, 300 AD, to being pretty much just a town of about, 20,000 people in the 1500s. And, I think that you're going to see remarkable changes in how those cycles play out in the America of the future. It's not going to just be a repeat of, the great bust of 1857 and the great boom of 1885, or it's going to be a different thing. We're leaving behind the techno-industrial era. We're moving into something else. I don't think it's going to be quite as snazzy as the techno-utopians believe. And the manifestations in growth and development are going to be way different.
So, are you describing just a smaller role for bankers and credit in the future, or do you?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I say when I speak about the definancialization of the economy. There's going to be less capital. We're already having trouble with capital formation because of the deformations of excessive debt. And that's only going to get more extreme. We're going to see wealth drain out of this society. A lot of it, as I said, will be wealth that wasn't really there in the first place. It was just kind of fantasized and assumed and notional. But the process of draining that wealth out of the society is going to increase in velocity, and we're going to get poorer faster, and we're going to have a lot less to work with. And it's not going to be about generating more and more debt for the future, because, the problem with this kind of a contraction is when you demonstrate that you already can't pay off your present debts, you're not going to be able to generate new debts, because no one will want to lend you money because they know that you already can't pay back your old debts. And that's exactly the situation we're in on the macro level, really worldwide, but especially in America.
So as far as like heuristics for making our cities more livable, I mean, people would make shortcuts and saying short blocks make things, people enjoy that. Long blocks you can't walk around are hell. Do you think those are useful as far as putting things together, and can they really? There is
a whole battery of principles and methodologies for designing cities better than we do. And a lot of it is embodied in the new urbanist movement, which I became very involved with in the 1990s. And it's a movement that continues. And they have campaigned to design towns and cities with more intelligence and more artistry than we have brought to it in our time, mostly because most of the urban design that we've had in our lifetimes has not even been urban design. It's just traffic engineering. And that has produced these immersively ugly, horrible, punishing environments that we're in. And the more we can get away from that and back to something approaching real artistry in building and designing and developing property, I think the happier we're going to be, even if we are a poorer society financially.
How do we do that? Is it just a matter of digging out this almost forgotten knowledge from the new urbanists and saying, put them in positions of power to design cities, or do we need to do other things, like, for instance, the fiscal system, land value tax? Are there other things that, in addition to that we haven't discussed, that would play a key role in our sort of, list off some really important things that would make that possible? Because
the most important thing to understand is this: it's not going to be a top-down planning process. Societies and the things that they do and the ways they behave are emergent phenomena. That is to say, they are self-organizing, and cities and towns themselves must be thought of as organisms, kind of living things that grow emergently. And they grow emergently in response to the circumstances that reality presents at a certain time. And that's how this will happen. Things that seem impossible today, like building a beautiful public building, will be normal, 30, 40, 50 years from now, as it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. If you look at the, if you look at the older courthouses and schools and other public buildings around America, it's astonishing how beautiful we were able to make them. And then we just stopped doing it. Why? Well, because circumstances allowed us to get away with it for a while. And now they won't. So we're going to have to go back to something different.
We've been talking to James Howard Kunstler. His new book is A Safe and Happy Place. We've been talking about the good and bad of what the future of cities will be. Thank you very much for being here today.
Okay, it was a pleasure.
It really is. Yeah, so this is the Henry George program. It's a presentation in KZSU Stanford. You can find old episodes and more at the website seethecat.org. KZSU Stanford.